It had only been about 20 years. 20 years ago, Solomon, the great king of the nation of Israel, the son of David, had passed away. But a lot had happened over 20 years. You see, in that 20-year time period, the kingdom split. 10 of the tribes went with another king, Jeroboam, in the north. They called themselves Israel. The 2 tribes that were left, they called themselves Judah, and they were called the southern kingdom. And they followed after Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Solomon's son reigned about 17 years, and he didn't exactly do the things that he should. And after him, his son reigned for about 3 more years, and he didn't do any better. So it had only been about 20 years since King Solomon had reigned. And even the last few years of Solomon's reign didn't go very well because Solomon allowed the wives to turn his heart away from God. But now, Solomon's great-grandson came into power as the king. His name was Asa. Asa was primarily a good king in Judah. He reigned for 41 years in the land of Judah. And God said that primarily his rule was good. In 2 Chronicles chapter 14, it said, "And Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He took away the foreign altars and the high places and broke down the pillars and cut down the Asherim and commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandment." He did good. Unfortunately, late in his tenure as king, when he was being pressured by the northern kingdom of Israel and Baasha, the king of Israel, instead of turning his trust toward God, instead of relying upon the God of his father David and his father Solomon, he turned to someone else, the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, and tried to put his trust in someone else. And because of that, the prophet Hananiah rebuked the king and said, "You have done foolishly in this, for from now on you will have wars." I thought about doing a lesson on what Asa did next. And what Asa did next was basically said, "I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that." But we didn't do the lesson on that. But from that point forward, Asa didn't have as much good in his kingdom. As a matter of fact, he became diseased in his feet and he died. But he was buried in the tombs of the kings because overall he was a good king. Then his son came into power. His son was by the name of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat reigned for 25 years in the land of Judah, and Jehoshaphat was a good king. He did a lot of good things because it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 19 and verse 3 that he set his heart to seek after God. It tells us over in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 17 and verse 3, "The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the earlier ways of his father David. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father and walked in his commandments and not according to the practices of Israel." I want you to consider with me a few things that Jehoshaphat did. Jehoshaphat took all the high places, or at least a lot of the high places, out of the land of Judah, and he took the Asherim, the idols out, and he tried to tell them this is not the way to go. He also taught the people. He sent his own officials, his royal officials, and he sent them out into the land of Judah. And he took the Levites and he sent them out into the land of Judah. And he sent them with the book of the law of God. And he said, "You teach the people the law of God. You have them know and understand what God's will is for us." That was unusual. But he took the time and effort to send his own officials so that the people might know and might understand the word of God. He fortified the land of Judah. He fortified their cities. He fortified their storehouses. He built up the land because God blessed him. Jehoshaphat appointed judges in the land. And he appointed them judges so that there might be justice in the land of Judah, so that they might recognize that God was in the land. and they might recognize that they ought to do good to one another, and they should follow God's law. Remember, he was teaching them the law, and he said, now here's your judges. You would judge them according to the law of God. This is a pretty good leader. And then in a time of national crisis, when they are being invaded by the Ammonites and the Moabites, instead of turning like his father did to another kingdom to ask for help, he and the people of Judah turned their hearts toward God. And they said, only you, God, can deliver us. And you know what God did? In 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 17, because they turned their heart to God, because they put their trust in him and him alone, and they said, it's only because of you that we can escape this. God said in 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 17, you will not need to fight in this battle. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf, O Judah and Jerusalem. It reminds me a lot of what Moses told the people when they were coming out of the land of Egypt. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord. And you know what happened? God delivered them. They didn't have to even fight. The enemy turned against themselves, and they fought each other, and they killed all of themselves. And Judah was able to just go down and pick up the spoil. Jehoshaphat was a good king. There were a couple of things. See, he made a couple of mistakes too, as men do. One mistake that he made was that multiple times throughout his reign, he tried to align himself with the kings of Israel. If you remember, one time he went up and aligned himself with Ahab, and they went out and they fought against Syria. And you remember the time, they asked for all the prophets to come to tell them, should they go up and fight against them? And all the false prophets came in and said, yeah, go up, God will give them to you. Is there no one else, Jehoshaphat asked, that we can ask that's a prophet of God? And there was Micaiah. He says, but Ahab said, but I don't like him. There's another potential sermon. I don't like him because he never prophesies anything good concerning me. By the way, if the people of God are always telling you you're doing something wrong, you might want to look. You're probably doing something wrong. Micaiah finally basically told him, yeah, it's not going to go well for you. I'm obviously paraphrasing. He says, you're not going to come back from this one, Ahab. And Ahab didn't. Ahab was killed in that battle. Another time, Jehoshaphat tried to align himself with Ahaziah, the king of Israel. And they tried to send out ships to Tarshish, but because he aligned himself with Israel, God did not allow that to happen. The ship sank. So he tried to align himself with Israel, and that didn't work out very well. But there was one particular mistake that I really want us to think about for a few minutes. You see, after Jehoshaphat had been established in his kingdom and God had given him riches and honor, he decided that he needed a political alliance with the nation of Israel. And here's what he did. He said, Ahab, Jezebel, I want to take your daughter and I want to marry her to my son, Jehoram. And we'll have an alliance together. Our kingdoms will now be together because of your daughter and my son. And so he gave his son a wife, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which I hope by now you recognize those names. A wicked king and a wicked woman. He made a marriage alliance with Ahab. That marriage alliance had lasting and devastating effect on the kingdom of Judah. After the death of Jehoshaphat, his son Jehoram came into power. And right before his death, Jehoshaphat had divided up some of his sons, and he says, I'm going to give them some inheritance. I'm going to give them some riches. I'm going to give them some cities, and they'll go out. But my kingdom is going to be Jehoram, my firstborn. It will be his to rule. But then Jehoshaphat died. And Jehoram, after he had been established, decided he didn't want anybody to have another position in the royalty, and he went out and he killed all of his brothers. all of them. Because of this, God sent his prophet to them, and he prophesied against Jehoram. And it says there, Jehoram, after he had spent 8 years and was very wicked, God punished him, and he died in great agony. And he has one of the saddest epitaphs that's ever recorded in the Bible. Jehoram, the son of the good King Jehoshaphat, died, and he departed with no one's regret. That's sad, isn't it? To think that you lived your whole life and that when you died, no one regretted it. Having died, Jehoram only had one son left because of the punishment, and his name was Ahaziah as well, another king named Ahaziah. This son only reigned for 1 year because he was wicked. And because of the punishment of God, he reigned 1 year. He did wickedness because his mother was his counselor. You remember who his mother was, we said just a minute ago? It was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Seeing that her son was dead, Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, usurped the throne and killed all the royal family. If you don't recognize what that means, that would mean that if she had any grandchildren, she killed them. And usurped the throne and reigned for about 6 years. You know, if you're Jehoshaphat and you were able to come back and you were able to look and see what happened in your lifetime, you'd look and see that, you know what, as a king, I didn't do half bad. I did a lot of good things, and I left my son with a kingdom that was in pretty good shape. But then if he looked at himself and judged himself as a father, I think he'd say, I did a poor job. Matter of fact, he'd probably say, I failed my son. I failed him. He might say, I didn't really give him a chance. What about me? I'm a father. I have 2 children, 2 great children. But let's be honest. One's 22, one's 20. They rely on me, still some, for physical things in life. But by this point in time, my influence on them is dwindling fast. It's the reality of life, whether we like it or not. I hope the influence that I can still have on them spiritually is some, but it's dwindling. They're able to make their own decisions and their own path in this life. I have a bunch of folks in the congregation this morning who's looking at me, and a lot of you out here are fathers. A lot of you are fathers. Some of you are in the same boat as me. Your children are at the ages that my kids are, and some of you have some that are older. And so you recognize that our influence is limited at best, and maybe even some of you, your influence is not as much on your kids maybe as it is on your grandkids now. What's your legacy? Some of you, though, have young children still. Those in your household that are very reliant upon you for everything. Are you taking your job seriously? I know it seems like you've got plenty of time. It always does when you've got young kids. Boy, I got plenty of time. And probably all you're worried about every day is when I get home, just let me make it through the rest of the day. Please just let me make it through, right? I'm tired, I'm beat, I'm worn out, I'm frazzled, I'm this, I'm that, and the other. Just let me make it till we can get the kids in bed, please. Right? You see, it's easy to think that you've got plenty of time. But you'll look up and they won't be there no more. The physical aspects of life, though, is not our goals, fathers. It's not just make a living. It's not just provide them food, clothing, and shelter. That's not it. You see, if that was it, Jehoshaphat did a great job. I don't think he said he did a great job. What is the goal of a father? Well, quite frankly, the simple answer for that, and the way that I've answered it this morning, is we need to give them a chance. You see, in the end, they'll be responsible for their own decisions, but we must at least give them a chance. So how do we give them a chance? We really only have one verse we're going to look at today. One verse. Imagine how short this could be. Ephesians 6 and verse 4 says, "Fathers, do not provoke," I misspelled that, "do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Do not provoke your children. It's interesting to me that Paul starts this particular exhortation to fathers with a negative. And by the way, this negative instruction that he gives to father is not just some filler material, right? Sometimes you have filler material in writings, things that just take up space. There's not really that much to it. It's just there, right? That's not what this is. When he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger," it's not filler material. It's instructions, and it's specific to fathers because, fathers, there's a pretty good chance that we can make our children angry. Now, we need to understand what kind of anger he's talking about here. You see, there's a real good chance, matter of fact, it's almost a surety, that if you do your job right, your children are going to get angry at you sometime. It's absolutely, positively sure. But that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about that your children get angry at you because you put barriers around what they're supposed to do and you help prevent them from getting into things that they're not supposed to be doing. He's not talking about that. If they get angry about that, that's misguided anger, that's inappropriate anger, and that would have to be dealt with, but that's not what he's talking about. The anger that he's talking about here is avoiding the kinds of behaviors, fathers, that will frustrate our children, that will frustrate them. It's the kind of behavior sometimes it's because we're too harsh. Maybe we're overburdensome. Or maybe we have unrealistic expectations that our children should act like we do. And yet they're children. They're not there yet. We have to be careful of those things. That was one I struggled with a lot. Still do, by the way. Unrealistic expectations. Thinking that your children are not going to make mistakes, that's just unrealistic. Thinking that they're not going to misbehave, that's not realistic, folks. Things are going to happen. So we need to make sure that we don't behave in such a way, fathers, that causes them to be angry. But I'm going to divert for just a minute and give you an opinion on something. Okay? This is my opinion on this. Now, I'm not going to give you an opinion on how you ought to act as a father. God is the authority on that, and He's told you how you ought to act as a father. So I'm not giving you that. It's in His Word, and it's perfect. This is how you ought to act as a father. What I'm going to give you is an opinion on what I think causes kids to get angry in our society. And I don't think, for the vast majority of cases, that they get angry because the fathers are overburdensome, unrealistic. I think our children are more likely in our society to be angry with their parents and their fathers because they're disengaged and disinterested. Did you hear me? Or are you disinterested? Disengaged and disinterested. You don't take part in their life like you're supposed to. I'm not talking about you individually. I'm talking about our society. You have to make a judgment for yourself on what you're doing. We have too many fathers in our society who are disengaged and disinterested in the lives of the children, and that causes them to be frustrated, angry in life. We are not to provoke our children to anger. But that's not the goal of fatherhood. He goes on to tell us what the goal of fatherhood really is. He says, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up. Bring them up. What does that word mean? What does that phrase mean? It comes from a Greek word that actually means to nourish up to maturity. Now, those of you who are in the auditorium class and have been studying the book of Hebrews with us, you ought to understand that word and that concept of bringing you to maturity, because we talked about that in becoming mature Christians, not infantile Christians, but growing to the part that we become mature. Now, it's obvious to us that our children are going to grow in a multiple different ways, in different avenues, in different areas of life, and we're responsible for all of those. We're responsible to help them to grow physically, to mature physically, to provide for them. But let's be honest again about it. If we provide them with a little bit of food and a little bit of drink, they're going to do that on their own. Right? They're going to grow like that on their own. I didn't have to tell my son to grow. He did that well on his own. Okay? So we don't have to tell them to do, we just have to kind of provide a few things for them there, and they do that. What we're really responsible for is the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual maturity of our children. And then we step back and say, well, I'm working on that, see? I'm working on that mental side of it, that mental maturity part. I'm sending them to school. I'm sending them to college. They're gonna grow and mature mentally because I'm providing for them. And emotionally, I'm providing for them. You see, I'm giving them all these experiences in life. And they're going to grow. They're going to grow emotionally because of those things. And spiritually, I'm doing that. I'm going to take them to church and let them learn. And so there's a great outcry out in our nation, in the denominational world, and even among brethren at times, of saying, what is the church going to do for our young people? And the answer is, folks, that's not who God gave the responsibility to. He gave it to fathers. Fathers, bring them up. Now, I want you to listen to me just for a second, fathers, because every one of us is going to have to give an account on the day of judgment. Every one of us. And when we have to go give an account, they're not going to ask, did the government provide for your spiritual maturity of your kids? They're not going to ask, did the preacher give the spiritual maturity to your kids? He's going to say, Ben, did you provide that for Darby and Jeb? Fathers, you will stand in judgment, not the church. You will. Fathers, bring up your children. Bring them to spiritual maturity. Help them to grow spiritually. Do you realize that when we're talking about helping them grow, we are supposed to be looking out to see what kind of person we want them to be when they grow up? What kind of husband or mother, husband, father, wife, mother, do you want them to be? What do you want them to look like? How do you want them to act? And you realize that should be governing how you treat them every day? When they're young, not after they've gotten to the point where they'll right the day before they get married. Well, you know, I better give you a few pieces of advice. Too late. Too late. How do you want them to act as a citizen of our nation and of our community? How do you want them to act as a worker in the secular environment? How do you want them to act as a neighbor? How do you want them to be as a child of God? You know, I was thinking about this lesson, and I'm sitting there thinking, when I pass from this life, which I will because everybody does, and my children are part of a congregation somewhere, whether here or somewhere else, what do I want people to think about them? Do I want them to think they're people that are strong in the Word, That I can have faith and confidence in those people that they're going to do what's right? Or are those the ones that are on the outside saying, well, we just got to keep bringing them along? What do you want for your children as Christians? Strong, faithful Christians, right? That's what we want. Then we should be acting like that today and teaching them today. When we're bringing them up into maturity, and I'm way out of time already, we've given two things. He gives us two things in this passage. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Those two words, discipline and instruction, are very similar in their meaning, but the Greeks who go into this, the scholars who know the difference between these words, say that there's a slight difference between the two. The first word, that's often translated discipline or training, emphasizes training by action. The second word, instruction, admonition, emphasizes training with words. Training with action, training with words. And what we understand is that they need both. You can't just tell them what to do and never show it. It won't work that way. And you can't just do things and expect them to understand everything. You've got to tell them. You need both for it to work. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. When we're teaching our children by what we do, we are training them in discipline. And I was going to talk real detail about these three areas, but I don't want to, what's the right word? I don't want to overuse my time, Alan. I'm already past. I'm not going to try to do too much. In discipline, how do you show your children how to act? Well, you act, right? We must use discipline. The Bible tells us over and over again that discipline is something that children need. It's something that we must do. Now, we shouldn't abuse it. It should be used consistently. It should be used as a means of training and not a means of anger or frustration, but it must be used. Must be used. How do we teach them in honor? We show it. We want our children to honor the authorities. We want our children to honor their neighbors. We want our children to honor their wives or husbands when they grow up. How do you show it in your life? Do you honor your wife, fathers? Do you teach your children by the way that you talk to your wife? The way that you help your wife? Do your children know that you honor them? How about in love? We teach our children you should love God. Do we show it in our lives? By the things that we do? By the way that we worship? By the way that we study? By the way that we pray? I had points on all these things. I didn't realize it was a 3-hour lesson. We need to teach our children by what we do. Show them the way. But he also said we teach our children by what we say. We must actually say it. We must actually teach our children verbally. Give me just a second to catch up in my notes. All right. If you take advantage of every opportunity that we give to bring your children to worship, to study, at most, at best, 2 hours a week, they would hear the Word of God being taught or preached. 2 hours. Now, since I'm a math guy, right, I like math, not showing a chart, just a math. 2 out of 168. 168 is the number of hours in a week. Total hours, 7 times 24. Do you realize that that is 1.2% of the time, max, that they would be getting taught? If I were to tell you your child only has a 1% chance of making it to heaven, would you like those odds? Would you like them? But Ben, you're being too harsh. I mean, people sleep, right? Okay, I'll grant you, we do sleep. So, 2 out of 112. I gave you 8 hours of sleep 7 days a week. I don't get that, by the way. But we'll say that you do. You realize you increased your odds from 1.2 to 1.8. You like those odds better? Well, I like them better. Still don't like them. Do you realize how much time and effort we put into training our children to be successful in this life? How much time do we give them in school every day and every week? Well, I did the math for you. If you assume 6 hours a day for 5 days a week, which, by the way, is probably on the low side because you got to have homework and other kinds of things, you know. Well, that's 26.8% of the waking hours. You think that's enough, guys? You feel comfortable with 1.8% of the time, and that's assuming that we come to every service and give them the opportunity and keep them awake for all the sermons, right? 1.8, you good with that? The eternal destiny of your child at 1.8%. You like that one? Well, God didn't like it either. And that's why he said, fathers, you teach your children. That's why we have the responsibility for teaching them. So, how do you do that? Turn the TV off, put the tablets down, put the phones down, and study. There's no great revelation here. Study. Take the time to study their Bible lessons with them. When you get to worship, when you get to the Bible class, it's to review what they've already learned. It's not to break ground. Right? We're not tilling, right? We're actually just going over. Learn to tell Bible stories. You say, well, I'm not a good storyteller. Okay. Learn to get better. Learn the story of David and Goliath. Learn the story of Joseph. Learn the story of Solomon. Learn the story of Jesus. Learn the story of Peter. Learn them and tell them to your children. They will learn. But only if you teach them. Only if you teach them. I didn't really think about my conclusion until just a few minutes ago. I had something else written down. 79 years ago today, 79 years ago today, on February 26th, 1944, a 10-pound baby boy was born to Ben and Irma Holt. My dad, Ronnie Holt. Be careful. This will get out of hand quick. I will tell you one thing about my mother and my father. And one thing only this morning. They gave me a chance. Now, what I do with that chance is up to me. But they gave me one. Are you giving your children a chance? They deserve it. You signed up for it. Give them a chance. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up. Bring them to a point of maturity in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. If you're here this morning, you're not a child of God. We want you to be one. If there's a way that we can help you in making your life right with God, we urge you and beg you to come as we stand and as we sing.